Britain likes to think of its coastline as the one thing that belongs to everybody. Right to roam, right to ramble, right to stand at the edge of the sea and feel small, except of course when it doesn't. There are stretches of British sand where that right quietly stops, where a red flag or a rusted sign or a forgotten Act of Parliament has done what the sea itself never could and kept people out. Some of these beaches are shut for a few hours a week. One of them was shut for 48 years. This is their story. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let's begin. Number 1. Broomhill, Burrows and Frainslake Bay, Pembrokeshire. Tucked behind the dunes of the Castle Martin Peninsula, southwest Wales, is a stretch of golden sand that most Pembrokeshire holidaymakers will never set foot on. Frainslake Bay lies immediately south of the rather more famous Freshwater West, and on a map it looks identical. Same cliffs, same swell, same white sand. The difference is that Frainslake sits inside the Castle Martin training area, a tank gunnery range acquired by the Royal Armoured Corps in 1938 and still to this day one of only 2 places in Britain where armoured vehicles are permitted to fire live rounds directly into the sea. The range covers roughly 6,000 acres of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, and when it is active, which is most of the year, the danger zone can extend up to 12 nautical miles offshore. Walkers on the Pembrokeshire coast path are diverted around the whole peninsula. There is a submerged mill in the dunes at Frainslake, half buried in sand, that nobody has properly excavated because nobody is allowed to dig there with a firing programme running overhead. In 2012, a young soldier on exercise nearby was killed by a stray round while resting in what was believed to be a safe area. It is not a place that forgives casual assumptions about where the danger actually ends. I have walked the coast path right up to the range boundary and looked down at that empty bay, tide going in and out over sand that hasn't had a footprint on it in weeks. There is something almost rude about a beach that beautiful being entirely uninterested in whether you ever see it. Local archaeologists have wanted into those dunes for years. Aerial photography suggests the submerged mill isn't the only structure buried in the sand at Frainslake. There are traces of older field systems too, ploughed under long before the tanks arrived, but every proposal to survey the site properly runs into the same brick wall. Nobody can guarantee the ground is clear of unexploded practice rounds, some of them decades old, and the Ministry of Defence, quite reasonably, isn't inclined to let archaeologists dig where soldiers still train with live ammunition. So the mill stays half buried, and the past waits its turn behind the present. Number 2, Manorbier Range, Pembrokeshire. A few miles along the same coast, near the postcard pretty village of Manorbier, with its Norman castle, sits a beach that looks from a distance entirely unremarkable. It is the Air Defence Range, part of the same defence training estate that runs Castle Martin, and it has been testing anti-aircraft missile systems since the years after the Second World War. What makes Manorbier interesting is not the beach itself, but what it is quietly measuring. Guided weapons are fired out over the Bristol Channel toward targets towed by aircraft or launched as drones, and the range exists to prove, again and again, that a missile does what it says on the tin before it is ever trusted to a real battlefield. Locals will tell you the giveaway is the sound, not gunfire exactly, more a tearing, whooshing crack that rolls off the cliffs on testing days. Access is managed through the same briefing system as Castle Martin, and the beach itself, tucked below the range buildings, is simply not part of anybody's holiday itinerary. There is a pleasing irony to Manorbier that I rather enjoy. The village above the range is one of the prettiest in Pembrokeshire. Its 12th century castle, the birthplace of the medieval chronicler Gerald of Wales, who once wrote that this was the most pleasant spot in all of Wales. Gerald never had to contend with a missile test schedule pinned to the parish notice board, but I suspect even he would have found something to say about a coastline that spent 800 years being merely picturesque before spending the last 70 being classified. Which brings us somewhat grimly to number 3. Number 3, Kirkcudbright training area, Dumfries and Galloway. On Scotland's Solway coast, the beaches around Kirkcudbright Bay belong to a training area that has been used by the British Army since the Second World War, chiefly for direct fire weapons practice. Tanks, again, and increasingly Javelin anti-tank missile systems fired across open sand toward the sea. What sets Kirkcudbright apart from its southern cousins is the sheer texture of the place. The Solway mudflats here are treacherous even without live ordnance involved. Fast tides, soft sand that can trap a vehicle in minutes, and the Ministry of Defence essentially inherited a landscape that was already half hostile to visitors before a single shell was ever fired. The range remains one of the busiest small arms and direct fire training grounds in Scotland, hosting units from across the British Army for weeks at a stretch. Firing notices are published, as they are everywhere else on this list, but the honest truth is that most people driving the coast road toward Kirkcudbright town have no idea the empty shoreline beside them is doing anything at all. The bay itself has form when it comes to keeping secrets. Long before the army arrived, this stretch of the Solway was a favoured route for smugglers moving brandy and tobacco between Scotland and the Isle of Man. The same tides that now complicate a training exercise having once complicated a customs officer's evening rather more usefully for the local economy. Old habits, it seems, simply changed uniform. Number 4. Buddon, Angus. On the east coast of Scotland, between Dundee and Carnoustie, a long spit of dune and machair called Buddon has been a military training ground since 1897, which makes it by a comfortable margin one of the oldest continuously operating firing ranges in the country. The training centre sits extraordinarily close to Carnoustie Golf Links, host of the Open Championship, which means that on any given summer week you might have professional golfers 300 yards from soldiers on a live range, separated by little more than a fence and a great deal of paperwork. Buddon's beach, running the full length of the peninsula, is a designated site of special scientific interest for its dune systems, and the same isolation that makes it useful to the army has made it extraordinarily good for wildlife. Little terns nest here in numbers that would be impossible on a beach with footpaths and dog walkers. The range remains active today, training reservists and regular units alike, and public access follows the familiar pattern: open on non-firing days, firmly shut, red flag flying on the rest. It amuses me no end that the Open Championship has been played at Carnoustie 6 times, most recently watched by tens of thousands of spectators, all of them standing within earshot of an active British Army range that simply happened to be quiet that particular week. Nobody schedules a major golf tournament next to a live fire exercise on purpose. It is one of those very British arrangements that works purely because everybody involved agrees, politely, never to mention how odd it actually is. Number 5. Cape Wrath, Sutherland. If you want the most dramatically named beach on this list, you need go no further than the very top left-hand corner of mainland Britain. Cape Wrath, the name comes from the Old Norse varf, meaning turning point. Nothing to do with anger, though the Atlantic here rarely looks anything but furious, has been a live firing range for the Royal Navy and RAF since the 1930s. The beaches beneath the Cape Wrath cliffs, among the highest sea cliffs on the British mainland, are used for naval gunfire support training and air-to-ground bombing practice. When the range is active, the Ministry of Defence closes not just the shore, but the surrounding hills, and the only public road onto the peninsula, a passenger ferry across the Kyle of Durness, followed by an 11-mile minibus track, is suspended entirely. There is a lighthouse out here built by Robert Stevenson in 1828, and a small community of exactly one full-time resident who keeps a cafe beside it. Everybody else who wants to stand on that beach has to check the firing programme first, because when the range goes live, this becomes, quite literally, one of the most dangerous stretches of coastline in Europe. Sandwood Bay lies just south of the range, and it is regularly named among the finest beaches in Britain, entirely wild, unreachable by road, and, on the days the firing programme allows it, entirely open to anyone willing to walk the 7 miles in. There is something fitting about the single most beautiful beach in Scotland, sitting directly beside the single most restricted, separated by nothing more than a line on a Ministry of Defence map and a great deal of Atlantic weather that doesn't much care which side of that line you're standing on. If you've made it this far and you're still with me, a like tells YouTube there are more of us than they think. Number 6, Browndown, Gosport, Hampshire. Not every forbidden beach on this list is remote. Browndown sits on the Solent, practically within sight of Portsmouth's naval dockyards, and has been Ministry of Defence property since the 1850s, one of the oldest continuously restricted stretches of coast in southern England. The range is used chiefly for small arms training by units based around Gosport, and the peculiar thing about Browndown is its double life. Part of the shingle beach is closed permanently to the public, marked with red and white posts along a boundary that has barely moved in a century and a half. But immediately alongside it, separated only by fencing, is open access land managed for nature conservation, home to natterjack toads and a rare beetle found almost nowhere else in Britain. So you can walk the coast path at Browndown, watch container ships queue for the Solent, and stand 200 yards from a beach you are legally forbidden to set foot on, all without quite realising where the line is. The Ministry of Defence and Hampshire's Wildlife Trusts have shared this stretch of coast for decades in a working arrangement that neither side seems in any hurry to change. Number 7, Eskmeals, Cumbria. On the west coast between the Lake District Fells and the Irish Sea, Eskmeals is a firing range with a slightly different job to most of the others on this list. Rather than training soldiers, it exists to test weapon systems themselves, armour, ammunition, explosives, under the management of Tyneham, the same defence technology company that runs MOD Shoebury Ness. Eskmeals has been used for ballistics testing since the First World War, and the beach and dunes here form part of a wider proving ground that also includes an underwater test range in the estuary of the River Esk, used to evaluate torpedoes and sonar systems in conditions that mimic open sea without the expense of actually going to sea. The dune system at Eskmeals is a site of special scientific interest in its own right, home to natterjack toads once again, and a range of coastal plants that thrive precisely because nobody has been permitted to build a caravan park on top of them. It is a beach doing two jobs simultaneously, one for the Ministry of Defence, one for nature, and doing rather well at both, largely by keeping people out of the equation entirely. Number 8, Cowden, East Yorkshire. Further round the coast on the rapidly eroding cliffs of Holderness sits Cowden, a smaller, less publicised range used by the Ministry of Defence for weapons and ammunition trials since the 1940s. The Holderness coast is famous, in a quiet and rather sad way, for being one of the fastest eroding coastlines in Europe, losing an average of around 2 metres of land a year to the North Sea. That means Cowden's range has spent 8 decades slowly losing ground, literally, to the sea it borders. Buildings that once stood safely inland now sit close to the cliff edge. Older test structures have simply gone over. The beach beneath the range remains closed to the public year-round, not only for safety reasons connected to ordnance, but because the cliffs themselves are actively collapsing and simply too unstable for casual walking. There is a peculiar understated tragedy to a firing range that doesn't need a fence to keep people out for much longer, because within a few more decades the sea will likely have taken the decision entirely out of anyone's hands. The whole of Holderness tells the same story, just more slowly. Villages that appear on medieval tax rolls, Ravens at Odd, Old Kilnsea, half a dozen others, have vanished into the North Sea entirely over the last 800 years. And Cowden's range is simply the most recent chapter of a coastline that has always treated permanence as more of a suggestion than a promise. Number 9, Holbeach, Lincolnshire. Across the wash from Norfolk, the vast tidal flats at Holbeach have served as an RAF bombing range since the 1920s and remain in use today by Typhoon squadrons practicing live weapons drops over the open sands. The range covers an extraordinary area. Tens of thousands of acres of salt marsh and mudflat exposed at low tide, disappearing again under the Wash's notoriously fast-moving water. What makes Holbeach worth including here, rather than simply another gunnery range, is the geography working against you twice over. Even without live ordnance, the Wash's tides are famous for catching out the unwary. King John is supposed to have lost his baggage train and possibly the crown jewels to these very sands in 12 and 16. Add an active bombing range on top of that, and you have one of the most comprehensively inadvisable places in England to go for a paddle. The RAF's Marham-based squadrons still use Holbeach regularly, and local birdwatchers, who are permitted onto the fringes when the range is inactive, will tell you the wading bird numbers here are spectacular precisely because so little else is allowed to happen on that mud. Number 10, Foulness Island and the Broomway, Essex. Now we come to one of the strangest access stories on this entire list. Foulness Island, at the mouth of the Thames estuary, has been Ministry of Defence property since 1849, when the War Office first began using the adjoining Shoebury Sands as an artillery testing site. Today the island is run by the defence technology firm Chinetti Q as MOD Shoebury Ness, and it remains an active weapons test and evaluation range, firing live ammunition out to sea most weekdays of the year. For centuries before any of that, the only way onto Foulness was a tidal path called the Broomway, 6 miles of hard sand running along the Maplin Sands, marked out by bundles of twigs shaped like upside-down brooms, said to predate the Romans. It has been described, not entirely as a joke, as the deadliest path in Britain because the incoming tide crosses it faster than a person can run, and mist here can erase any sense of which direction the shore actually lies. Parish records are full of the drowned. Add a live firing range on top of an ancient tidal death trap, and you have Foulness, an island where the danger changes shift, from the tide by day to the ordnance the rest of the time, and where the Ministry of Defence's own range sea danger area is, by its own bylaws, closed to marine traffic permanently, regardless of whether a single shot is being fired that day. The island still has around 200 residents, farmers mostly, whose families have lived there since long before the War Office arrived, and whose ordinary weekly life involves a certain amount of waiting for the red flags to come down before the children can be collected from the mainland. There is a small heritage centre, open one Sunday a month between April and October, where the story of Foulness before and after the ministry took it over is told largely by the descendants of the people who never left. In 2002, a fatality during radiological dispersal trials elsewhere on the range prompted a wider review of safety procedures across the whole Shoebury Ness complex, a reminder that the danger here has never been entirely theoretical for residents or for trespassers alike. Number 11, Orford Ness, Suffolk. If Foulness is strange, Orford Ness is stranger still. This 10-mile shingle spit off the Suffolk coast, the largest vegetated shingle formation in Europe, was requisitioned by the War Department in 1913 for aircraft testing, and by 1953 had become the base for the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment, Britain's principal facility for testing the components of its nuclear arsenal throughout the Cold War. No fissile material was ever brought to Orford Ness, as far as anybody has been able to establish. What was tested here inside 6 vast concrete laboratories nicknamed the pagodas for their distinctive shingle-mounded roofs was everything else. How the casing of a bomb like Blue Danube withstood vibration, extreme heat, extreme cold and violent G-forces, all under remote control, because a failure in the high explosive initiator alone could have levelled the building. The Ministry of Defence handed the site to the National Trust in 1993, and it opened to visitors 2 years later. But even now, access is by ferry only. Numbers are strictly limited and large sections remain closed because unexploded ordnance is still, on occasion, found buried in the shingle. Bomb disposal teams are still called out here several times a year. The beach that runs the full length of the spit is one of the loneliest in England, and one of the very few places on Earth built quite deliberately to survive its own explosions. The first drop test of a Blue Danube casing, Britain's earliest operational nuclear weapon, took place on 11 June 1955, released from a Vickers Valiant bomber flying out of RAF Wittering, its 20-kiloton payload swapped for ballast. No fissile core officially was ever anywhere near Orford Ness. But the high explosive initiator very much was, which is precisely why those pagoda laboratories were built the way they were, with pillar-supported concrete roofs designed to lift skyward rather than blow sideways if the worst ever happened. It never did. The buildings still stand, roofs sagging now, colonised by nesting gulls who showed not the faintest interest in the several decades of Cold War secrecy going quietly derelict beneath their feet. We've covered the ranges and the research stations. Next time we go underground into the bunkers built to survive what these beaches were built to test. You won't want to miss it. Number 12, Worbarrow Bay, Dorset. Some beaches are closed not by ordnance but by grief. Worbarrow Bay sits within the Lulworth Ranges on the Isle of Purbeck, a mile's walk down a quiet valley from the ruined village of Tyneham. On 16th November 1943, the War Office issued a requisition notice for Tyneham and its surrounding 7,500 acres needed for live fire training ahead of the D-Day landings. 252 people were given 28 days to leave. The last church service was held on 19th of December 1943, and as the congregation filed out, someone pinned a note to the door. "We shall return one day and thank you for treating the village kindly." They never did return. After the war, the army decided the land was too useful to give back, and in 1948 a compulsory purchase order made the arrangement permanent. 92-year-old Charlie Miller of Worbarrow, seriously ill, waited 24 hours for an ambulance that never came during the evacuation and died within days, having begged to be taken home. Today, Tyneham and Worbarrow Bay are open to the public on weekends and public holidays. When the ranges fall quiet, the beach itself perfectly ordinary, pebbles and low cliffs and Jurassic coast views betraying nothing of what it took to empty it. The rest of the time, red flags fly and the valley returns to the army that has held it one way or another for over 80 years. Number 13, Gruinard Island, west of Ross. Nobody agrees on quite how to rank horror, but if any beach on this list deserves the word forbidden without qualification, it is this one. In the summer of 1942, scientists from Porton Down's biology department requisitioned the small, uninhabited island of Gruinard, half a mile off Scotland's northwest coast, for an experiment connected to Operation Vegetarian, a plan ultimately never used to drop anthrax-laced cattle feed across Germany. A flock of 80 sheep was tethered on the island's beach and exposed to an exploded anthrax bomb. Every one of them was dead within days. What the scientists hadn't fully accounted for was how long the spores would survive. In 1943, a dead sheep drifted across to the mainland and killed animals there too. The government quietly paid compensation and said nothing further for years. Gruinard remained under quarantine, the longest quarantine of any island in recorded history, for 48 years. In 1981, a group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos began leaving buckets of contaminated Gruinard soil outside government buildings, including Porton Down itself, to force the issue back into the open. Decontamination finally began in 1986. 280 tonnes of formaldehyde solution sprayed across every acre of the island. On 24th April 1990, a junior defence minister walked ashore and removed the last warning signs. The original owner's family bought the island back for the price agreed in 1946, £500 unchanged by inflation or history. You can view Gruinard's beach from the A832 today. Almost nobody lands there. I want to be careful with this one because it would be easy to reach for the word haunted and leave it at that, and this channel doesn't do that. What happened on Gruinard was not a ghost story. It was a documented government-sanctioned biological weapons trial that contaminated a piece of Scotland for the best part of half a century, disclosed to the public only in fragments, and closed only when a handful of protesters made the alternative, continued silence, more expensive than the truth. That is a very different and rather more uncomfortable kind of forbidden than a firing range with a red flag. Number 14, Donna, Nook, Lincolnshire. Not every entry on this list is grim, and I promised you variety, so let's end the darker stretch of the list somewhere rather more tender. Donna Nook on the Lincolnshire coast has been an RAF bombing and gunnery range since 1926, used for live weapons training that continues to this day. Typhoon squadrons still practice cannon fire and flare drops here. And yet, since the 1970s, grey seals have been quietly colonising the very same beach, choosing it precisely because the restrictions that keep people away also keep predators and disturbance away. More than 2,000 pups are now born on Donna Nook's sands each winter, one of the largest grey seal breeding colonies in England, thriving on a beach that officially exists to practice blowing things up. The arrangement works because the Ministry of Defence and the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust simply divide the calendar. Seal season runs alongside range operations. Red flags mean stay well back, and somehow nobody, not the seals, not the pilots, seems especially bothered by the others' presence. It is by some distance the most improbable co-tenancy on this entire list. Number 15, St Kilda, Outer Hebrides. And so we come, at the very edge of the map, to the loneliest beaches in Britain. St Kilda is an archipelago 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, so remote that its last islanders, around 30 people, living much as their ancestors had for 1,000 years, asked to be evacuated in 1930, unable to sustain the community any longer. Since then, the only permanent human presence on Hirta, the largest island, has been a small radar tracking station used since the 1950s to support missile testing on the Hebrides range further south. St Kilda's beaches sit within a national nature reserve, a UNESCO World Heritage Site recognised for both its natural and its cultural landscape, one of only a small handful of places on Earth to hold that dual status. And access is tightly controlled by both the National Trust for Scotland and the weather, which makes a landing possible on perhaps half the days of any given year. The cliffs here are the highest in Britain, home to nearly 1 million seabirds, and the beach at Village Bay looks out on ruined black houses that nobody has lived in for close to a century. It is not forbidden in the way Gruinard was forbidden or Foulness is forbidden. It is simply so far out, so weather-battered, and so thoroughly abandoned by the people who once called it home, that reaching its sand at all remains one of the genuine achievements of British travel. The 1930 evacuation was voluntary in the strict legal sense. The islanders petitioned the government themselves, exhausted by isolation and dwindling numbers, but voluntary is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Some of the last islanders, resettled on the mainland, had never used a bus or paid rent in their lives, and at least one struggled for years afterward with a homesickness that no amount of mainland comfort ever quite resolved. Their houses still stand along Village Bay, roofless now, numbered doorways facing a beach that once held an entire working community and now holds, on a good day, a handful of National Trust volunteers and whatever seabirds happen to be passing. So there they are, 15 beaches and 15 different reasons the sea got there before you did. Tanks and torpedoes, tides and typhoons, anthrax and abandonment. Not one of them was closed out of spite. Every single one was closed because somebody at some point decided the coast was more useful or more dangerous or simply more fragile, left alone. I sometimes think that's the real story of this island. We are forever drawing lines across our own coastline, red flags, bylaws, requisition orders, quarantine notices, evacuation papers signed in a hurry during a cold December, and forever forgetting, until a programme like this one comes along, that we drew them at all, or that somebody somewhere is still standing on the wrong side of every single one. I am an old man and an old man worries, mind how you go.